The Detroit Lions needed to win a Super Bowl this season. With an aging roster, expiring contracts, and a Super Bowl window that is very quickly closing, the Lions need to capitalize on their success, capitalize on the situation that they are in before their star players leave, before their contracts get expensive, and before things get really, really tight. And today, that is what we will be doing. We will be going through the Detroit Lions 2025 offseason from initial roster cuts to free up cap space, all the way through the NFL draft and 2025 depth chart to give you guys a sneak peek at the offseason yet to come, get familiar with the players, familiar with the draft prospects, and take a look at what this roster could look like as the Lions gear up for a Super Bowl showdown in 2025. Now, the best place we're going to start is exactly where we said. We're going to start off with the cuts of the offseason because there will be a few. The Detroit Lions currently sit with $46 million in cap space, just over the 8th ranked spot in the NFL. They are in a good situation. They have enough money to re-sign some players, enough money to go out and sign free agents, but they don't have 100, 150, 130 million dollars like some of these other franchises have, but they have enough. And I do think that they will cut some players to free up some cap space. They seem to do so every year, or they restructure contracts to open up money right now. And I think there are two main candidates. A lot of people talk about Zadarius Smith. A lot of people talk about a lot of different players for a potential roster cut. But I think there's only two that really make sense. And that is Graham Glasgow and Broderick Martin. Now, Graham Glasgow has been a good player for Detroit. Was drafted by Detroit, then went to Denver, came back to Detroit 2 seasons ago, was really good 2 seasons ago, but this season really didn't live up to his contract. If the Detroit Lions do end up cutting him, they'll pay about $1.6 million in dead cap and free up about $3.5 million in open cap space. Graham Glasgow is a player that, again, was really good a few seasons ago. A player that a lot of Lions fans really liked, a lot of Lions fans really looked up to, and a lot of Lions fans wanted to see continue to succeed. But he just didn't. He moved to the left side of the offensive line where he just played worse, got beat more often, and really became more of a liability on the offensive line than a true bona fide starter. Freeing him up could potentially mean that you can throw $2-3 million extra dollars at Carlton Davis, could throw $2-3 more million at, a Kevin Zeitler, and potentially retain guys that are still playing at a very high level while potentially moving off of a guy that just isn't necessary on the roster anymore. I think Broderick Martin is the same way, a former third-round pick in year 3 of his NFL contract. He's not super expensive, going to cost the Lions about $1.8 million, but I think at this point, the Broderick Martin experiment is over. He's a player that just hasn't played very well, a player that doesn't seem to be ready for the NFL level, and a player that is really the first big miss of Brad Holmes' career. He's a player that just never really panned out, a player that probably will never pan out for the Detroit Lions, and freeing up that $1.8 million again means you could throw an extra 2 at Carlton Davis. You can throw an extra 2 at Derek Barnes, and adding an extra $4 to $5 million could be the difference between signing a couple of these key starters and losing them to the free agent market. After these moves, the Detroit Lions sit at about $50.6 million, adding about $4.5 million. Nothing incredible, nothing crazy, but again, it's the little bit that counts, and a little bit can go a long way when you throw an extra $2 million on 2 or 3 different contracts. Now, taking a look at the free agent re-signings, I think this is where the Detroit Lions are going to be really, really aggressive, because if you look at the rest of the free agent markets, it's not very good, right? There's a lot of older veteran talents. There's a lot of players that have been around the NFL for a long time, but are going to be quite expensive or not any longer in their prime of their football career and just aren't really the biggest fits for Detroit in what they are looking to do. So I think a majority of that $46 million is going to go to players already on the roster. And I use SpotTrack for a lot of these contracts and a lot of these market values. So if you disagree with SpotTrack, I do apologize, but I do think roughly these are where we should expect to see players. And the first big couple are the big stars, right? Carlton Davis, I think, signs a contract 3 years, $14 million a piece. And while I do think he could get a little extra on the open market, I think he takes a bit of a hometown discount. The Lions last offseason took a massive risk on Carlton Davis. He was coming off of the worst season of his NFL career. They traded a third-round pick for him. And not only that, but they gave him extra money. They didn't have to, but they restructured his contract to give him more money in 2024. And I think that the Lions could get repaid for that gratitude. Carlton Davis came in and played a really good season, was a great cornerback for the Lions, was big, was physical, and was everything the Detroit Lions wanted from a starting cornerback in a CB1. I think that kindness, I think that the faith that they put into Carlton Davis could be repaid as early as this offseason, where he could go get 16, $17 million on the open market, but he comes back home for 14, gets a 3-year contract, gets quite a bit of it guaranteed, and becomes and maintains his spot as CB1 for the Detroit Lions. And I think that Kevin Zeitler does the same thing. I think he gets a 1-year, $7 million contract, a little bit more than last offseason for a player that is a little bit older, is a little bit out of his prime, but is still coming off one of the best seasons of his NFL career. Kevin Zeitler could retire this offseason. That is a very, very high possibility as a player that has accomplished a lot, a player that has nothing left to prove in the NFL. But I do think if the Lions bring up the pitch and they say, hey, we want to bring you back one more season, let's get a real shot at a Super Bowl here. Last year, we were the 1 seed. We had a lot of injuries. This season, we're going to come back. We're going to be healthier. We're going to be better. We're going to really, truly compete for this bowl game. I think that Kevin Zeitler could give it one more go. And I think 1 year, $7 million is very, very agreeable to do it with. Derek Barnes, I think, also comes back 3 years, $7 million per year. I based his contract off of what Alex Anzalone just got a couple of years ago. Very similar story, 4th-round pick, great leader, great team guy, puts up good statistics, got a 3-year, $7 million a year contract from the Detroit Lions just 2 seasons ago. I think Derek Barnes could get a very similar contract, a great leader, brings a ton of intensity to the defense and does a lot of good things. Is he the best linebacker on the team? No, but he is the Lions' best Sam linebacker on the team. And there was a massive fall off from him to Trevor Nowaske when Derek Barnes went down with a major injury in week 3. I think John Kaminsky and Tim Patrick both return on pretty cheap deals. Tim Patrick, a 31-year-old wide receiver, but maybe found a home in Detroit. Again, kind of like Carlton Davis, they took a shot on him after Denver released him after back-to-back ACL tears. And he was really good. He's a big wide receiver. He's a physical wide receiver. He moves people in the run game. He's a reliable guy in the red zone. He is a really good fit for what Jared Goff and the Lions like to do. And I think he could return. Spotrac has his value at $2 million per season. I think he could come back for that, maybe even a little bit more, 3.5, but it's still well worth it for a quality wide receiver 3. And then John Kaminsky, a player that has been big for the Detroit Lions over the last several years, but was injured last year. Tore his MCL in training camp, never was able to return, but is a consistent 2, 3, 4 sack player for the Lions. And for $1 million a season, I think you could potentially see him return and at least at the very worst, be a depth player, be the edge rusher 3, be the edge rusher 4, be a guy that, if somebody does go down, you would trust that John Kaminsky can at the very least hold a decently high quality level of play and not let that quality fall due to the level of injuries. Now, we're not done there. We have a couple other prove-it deals. Dan Skipper, I think, gets 2 years, $2 million. He's a fan favorite. He's the offensive line that comes in when you need an extra offensive lineman. He's the 6th guy. He is a tight end sometimes. He runs routes sometimes. He's a fan favorite. I think the Lions want to bring him back. His size, his blocking ability. He's never going to be a starter. He'll never start on the offensive line. But, rotating in at tight end, being an extra blocker works for the Lions, and I think they want to keep that ability on their offensive line. Ifeatu Melifonwu is a very talented player, a very versatile player, but a very injury-prone player. You bring him back on a 1-year prove-it deal. He had 1 great year 2 seasons ago, played well when he was healthy this season, but can he stay healthy? That is the biggest question mark. You put him on a 1-year deal. If he's healthy, awesome. You have a great, young, versatile, talented safety. If not, you're not wasting a ton of capital and you can move on from him or even cut him if he doesn't end up staying healthy through the offseason and the preseason. Kyle Pico, I think, is the same way. He's a veteran presence that was supposed to start last year but got injured in week 4. Bringing him back on a 1-year, $1.2 million contract makes sense for the defensive line depth. Trevor Nowaske is the backup Sam linebacker. Get him 2 years, $800,000 apiece. Kendall Vildor, 1 year, $1 million, as is the same with Craig Reynolds. You're not going to find any stars in this group, but you are going to find a lot of quality depth. Dan Skipper is the 6th offensive lineman. He comes in a lot and plays quite a bit. Ifeatu Melifonwu is the safety 3, still plays quite a bit of football and is very impactful. Kyle Pico can rotate, especially with Aleem McNeil potentially not being ready for week 1. Trevor Nowaske stepped up in a big spot last year when Derek Barnes went down with an injury, as did Kendall Vildor when the secondary started to look quite thin. And Craig Reynolds is a guy that the Detroit Lions just love to keep around and they love to have in their building. So with that being said, This is what the roster currently looks like. As the Lions go into free agency, they have quite a few good players, right? The roster is fairly well filled out. And looking at it from a just talent perspective on the top end, there really isn't a whole lot missing, right? You have Aiden Hutchinson, Aleem McNeil, DJ Reader on the defensive line. You have, Carlton Davis, you have Amik Robertson, you have Terran Arnold, you have Ennis Rakestraw potentially in the slot. So the secondary looks pretty good with Joseph and Branch and Malafanu returning. The offense is pretty much filled out across the board for all of your starters. There's not going to be any new starters on offense next year if you can really help it. And going into free agency, there isn't a whole lot left to spend on. And that means that these players are walking, right? Marcus Davenport, Levi Onwuzurike, Al-Qaeda Muhammad, Emmanuel Mosley, Khalil Dorsey won't play next season, Michael Badgley, Teddy Bridgewater, Ezekiel Turner, Allen Robinson, Benjamin Neiman, Pat O'Connor. These are all players that did play last year, except for Michael Badgley. These are all players that did have an impact on the Detroit Lions. But whether it be due to their market value, the ability to upgrade over their talent, or just maybe not fitting with the Detroit Lions anymore, I think the Lions could potentially move on and find themselves in a better situation regardless. Now, moving into the free agency market, I do think that the Lions will add a couple of free agents, but unlike the last two off seasons, I don't think they're going to add any big names. I don't think the Detroit Lions spend more than $10 million on a singular free agent this season because they have no starters left. They're filling out their free agent needs mostly for depth at this point, mostly for guys that can come in, can start if necessary, but guys that you really don't want to be starting for your roster. There isn't an open roster spot. There isn't an open starting spot for the Detroit Lions outside of maybe the edge rusher 2 spot on this entire roster. So you're not going to spend starting caliber money for a player that isn't going to start. With that being said, I think I found a number of free agents that fit what the Detroit Lions fit what the Detroit Lions need, and won't be very expensive at all. Peyton Turner from the New Orleans Saints has about 2 to 3 sacks a season every single year. He's never been a full-time starter, but has been a rotational pass rusher in New Orleans since being drafted out of Houston a few seasons ago. He's 6'6". He defends the run really well and is a player that I think the Lions could bring in on a 1-year, pretty cheap contract and not have to worry about their edge rushing depth anymore, right? He's better than Al-Qaeda Muhammad. He's better than what the Detroit Lions had at the edge rusher position last year. He's going to come in and be the edge rusher 3, be the edge rusher 4. He's going to be behind Pascal. He's going to be behind Kaminsky, but he's going to be the 5th edge rusher, be an upgrade over Al-Qaeda Muhammad while being roughly the same price, being a great run defender, adding a lot of size and adding just some quality, healthy depth. Javon Kinlaw, I think you give him a 2-year deal, kind of a better, more upgraded version of what Levi Onwuzurike is, while being at a market value of about $4.5 million a season. I think he'll be the biggest player because I think he'll play the most of the snaps that any of these free agents do. But even then, he's a rotational guy. He sits behind Aleem. He sits behind Reader. He sits behind potentially even Kyle Pico. And while you never really see Javon Kinlaw play 50, 60% of snaps in a game, you give him 30, 40% of the snaps. He's a rotational edge rusher, rotational pass rusher from the inside. You could really see a potential opportunity for Javon Kinlaw to find a role in Detroit. I think Greg Gaines is the same way. A veteran defensive lineman from Tampa Bay follows Casey Johnson over from the defensive line room. I think he is just a good run defender. Reminds me a lot of Kyle Pico's situation last year. Add that depth. Even if they get cut, even if they don't end up making the roster, add as many players on the defensive line as possible and give yourself as much competition and as much depth as you can. In the secondary, I actually would be really excited for the Lions to add Ashton Davis. He's a player I talked about a few days ago as a potential free agent target. This is a guy that, despite playing just 25% of snaps last year, came away with 2 interceptions, is a big hitter, a great special teams player, flies around the field. He is a great fit for what the Detroit Lions want. I don't know if Aaron Glenn will let him leave the building, but if he does, I would give him a 2-year deal for his 29 and age 30 seasons. Bring him in to be a Detroit Lion, especially if you don't bring back Ifeatu Melifonwu. And I think that you could really add a quality player who's a bit more healthy and a bit more impactful than Ifeatu at the age of 29. I added KJ Osborne for a 1-year contract. I think with letting Allen Robinson walk, with potentially, Khalif Raymond being an aging star, with Tim Patrick being a little bit older, I think that KJ Osborne is a player that just a few years ago was putting up 400, 500, 600 yards and 4 touchdowns. He had a rough go at it with the New England Patriots, but again, who doesn't have a rough go with the New England Patriots offense? I think he can come in, be a good wide receiver 5, potentially be a wide receiver 6. Maybe doesn't make the roster, but at the very least gives you another option at wide receiver for a good slot guy and a good player that has some reliable hands and has made good plays over the years. And the last one will be the biggest controversy. I think the Detroit Lions signed Jeff Okudah. He's 26 years old. He's still a big cornerback. He's physical. He plays press man. He's played in this system before. The coaches seem to really like him by the way they talk about Okudah. And he's a journeyman. He absolutely is. But he's no longer the third overall pick. He is a former first round pick who never really worked out, who will be probably no more than $3, $4, $5 million in the offseason. He comes in, replaces what Emmanuel Moseley was supposed to be, and you upgrade at that position. Is he going to start? No. Is he going to be cornerback 1, 2, 3, 4? Absolutely not. But if you get down to cornerback 5, right, you get to where you would have needed Emmanuel Moseley a season ago. Jeff Okudah, at the very least, has starting experience, fits the Detroit Lions system, fits the Detroit Lions scheme, knows some of these coaches and knows a bit of the coaching staff and the players, and I think could be welcomed back with open arms for a relatively cheap contract and a big upside to very, very minimal risk. So with that being said, I think that they add a couple of depth players. I don't think they add a single starter on either the offense or the defense in free agency. And as we go into the NFL draft, I don't think they add a whole lot of starters there either. This offseason is about getting ready, gearing up, right? Last year, at the beginning of the season, they were the best team in football. They had the top 2 offense. They had the top 2 defense. They fell apart because of depth. They fell apart because they didn't have enough depth to continue with all of the injuries. That is where the Lions will focus their needs this season. They will draft players. They will sign players. They will be more prepared this year for a major injury than they were in years prior. They are now a talented roster. Now they need more structure underneath the flash and the talent. Going into the draft, I think that they go pretty heavy on the defensive line. This is a mock draft that I put together. I think it's a good one. At 28, you draft Jack Sawyer, a great run defender, a good pass rusher, a big motor guy. Great leadership from Ohio State. He comes in as a national champion and adds to the Detroit Lions defensive line. TJ Sanders from South Carolina is a good interior defensive lineman, could replace DJ Reader when he is gone after this season. I think he's your potential DJ Reader long-term option while also being an immediate impact player as Aleem McNeil continues to recover. Malachi Moore at 101, just a versatile safety, slot cornerback. Reminds me a little bit of Brian Branch, plays the role that Brian Branch left behind at Alabama. He's a really good player and I think is a great instincts, is a great ball getter, and is just really an overall really, really talented player. He joins the safety core, meaning potentially maybe you get rid of one of those guys or you just play them at slot cornerback. You live with a couple of safeties and you let both Davis and Ifeatu walk after next year. I think Malachi Moore kind of shores you up if Brian Branch leaves. He shores you up if Kirby Joseph leaves. He shores you up if Ifeatu leaves. He's a future-proof guy. And at 101, I think that's exactly what the Detroit Lions will look to do. At pick 133, I have the Lions drafting Kobe Bryant, the cornerback out of Kansas. Had a great season at Kansas, 4 interceptions, 2 touchdowns allowed. Again, brings an attitude, is a strong tackler, is a good cornerback, and I think just adds some really quality depth at a position that the Lions didn't have a whole lot last year. Luke Locke, the tight end from Iowa. You always draft tight ends from Iowa. They are very good, even in an offensive system that wasn't very productive last year. Locke looked really good, made some standout plays, and looked kind of like TJ Hawkinson and kind of like Sam Laporta did, even when the Iowa offense wasn't putting up massive numbers. Nick Nash at 227, I think is a good option. Big body wide receiver. Reminds me a little bit of Puka Nacua coming out of a small school. Big physical wide receiver, good catch radius, good hands, but is going to go a little bit under the radar in the 4th, 5th, 6th round because he went to San Jose State. Cody Simon joins the linebacking core at 230, and then Jacob Gideon joins the offensive line at 246. This draft shores up the defense. It shores up the offensive line a little bit. It adds a couple of quality players on offense, a couple of starters / future starters on defense. I think it really fills out the roster nicely as we go into the 2025 season. Now, I know that was a lot, but this is the final roster I put together for the Detroit Lions. And we'll do more of these as the road goes on. We'll do more of these as the Lions approach free agency. We'll do more of these as the Lions approach the NFL draft. But this is my original concept. This is what I want to see from the Detroit Lions. A lot of depth on defense, a lot of depth in the secondary and in the trenches. Address the trenches on both sides of the football and bring back the players that you know are going to help you win. I think that this roster can win the Lions a Super Bowl. It is talented. It is deep. It is still well within contract and still well within the cap space that the Lions have. 2026 is going to get a bit tight, But we're not focused on that right now. We're focused on the 2025 season, winning as many games as possible, going to a Super Bowl, winning that championship. And I think that this roster could be the one to get it done. Last year, the Lions had a top 2 defense before Aiden Hutchinson got hurt. They had a top 1 offense throughout the entirety of the season. If this roster can stay healthy, if Anzalone can stay on the field, if Hutchinson and McNeil, and Reeder, and Davis and Joseph and Branch can all stay on the field healthy together, there is no reason this team cannot achieve what they should have last year. There is no reason they can't be back to the top 2, top 5 defense and top 5 offense that they were to start the 2024 season. This is a team that can win the Super Bowl, and with an offseason like this, that dream has become a reality. So with that being said, that is all for you guys today. I know that was a lot of information, a lot of names, a lot of numbers, but this is the final roster I have put together. Let me know down in the comments below any changes you would make, any free agents you would sign, any draft picks you would change. I'd love to hear down in the comments below. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys right now. Thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, and as always, go Lions.